and welcome back, guys, to the Self-Selecting Podcast. I am your host, Corey Hagman. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being here. Just had a really good morning recording with Phoebe Hagen. We actually did something kind of cool. Recorded for her podcast, which at the time that this is coming out, I mean, she's posting it we're talking about Monday, October 7th. So, I mean, at this point, when you see this, because this isn't coming out till probably end of October, maybe even early November, yeah, 2 full episodes accessible. So if you have not checked those out, if you've not checked out my episode with Phoebe on her channel, go give that a listen. Really cool to be able to connect with someone that, I've known for this span of time. I don't know why I said that so ambiguously. Known for such a long span of time within the competition space. I mean, she's one of the few individuals that, I truly am inspired by, from a business perspective, who also is one of the top Olympian athletes. And just to be able to sit and connect with her, that was nice. That was really enjoyable. So now we are getting it rolling, getting back set up to now record solo podcast. And today, this solo specifically, we are covering my favorite cheat codes to dieting. Yeah, that sounds hacky. Yeah, that sounds gimmicky, but I can tell you these are things that, frankly, and this is kind of what I talked about with Phoebe. It was interesting because these are all things that I was I've made notes about, and I've listed out as okay, these are things that matter more past the point of just getting the diet right, past the point of just doing things correctly. These are tools and tricks that essentially have allowed me to make better and faster progress. And I don't know, maybe even in some ways allowed me to avoid some of the common pitfalls that accompany fat loss phases, specifically when you are, someone who is managing your diet yourself. If you are a self-coach, these are very common areas in which I think you can kind of get lost in, especially intrinsically. So what I want to do, I want to walk you through, and I want to take you through the 6 non-conventional cheat codes, ways that I have circumvented specific obstacles that I've run into. And that's essentially where a lot of these podcast topics come from. It's through conversation, through talking either with Jordan, talking with clients, talking with fellow competitors, even where, thinking about it, I'm past just knowing the macros, past just knowing I need to eat less and I need to move more. There are secrets, there are tricks, tricks of the trade. And I think a lot of this can get very abstract, and that's why most of these videos surrounding dieting, surrounding muscle gain, they have to do with the intrinsic work and really putting in enough time to figure out okay, why are you running into that same wall again and again? And why does it keep re-emerging despite, you being further along in your, fat loss or, competitor journey? So I think when it comes down to it, there is a belief that fat loss, if you're doing things absolutely correctly, that it should only be so hard and that it should get easier. And I can attest to this, it can get easier, the actual process of dieting, but the process of dieting has only gotten easier with the ability to regulate and to really understand where these feelings and these thoughts come from. And I pull it back to I've had clients where, they come to me and they're it's really hard for me to lose weight. I struggle to lose weight no matter what I do. I can be adherent, I can be consistent, but frankly, it just sucks. The gruel of actually dieting down, it never seems easier. And I feel maybe it is because I'm doing something wrong or I'm focusing on the wrong things. And typically this also stems from someone's comparison that they're making internally. They look at someone else and they're well, this person doesn't diet on nearly as little calories as I do, or this person diets and they make great progress, but they don't do any cardio. And usually this starts with a desire to be hey, however they're dieting initially, there's the motivation to find a better way, that doesn't suck nearly as bad. Now, the things that have really allowed me to like overcome some of the hardest diets that I've done. And at this point, I mean, like, I would say the last prep I did, like by far the leanest I've gotten, not the hardest, arguably the easiest diet. Like when you look at the total amount of weight that I actually lost and like the span of time and like, doing it, balancing it alongside school and working full time, I'm like, wasn't that hard. It was actually pretty seamless. And yet I got to a very, very lean physique. I got to my leanest physique. Like I was inside out. The diet before that, diet in 2021, probably the hardest one I've done to date. And I think a lot of this had to do with not having a good means in which I regulated negative thoughts that I was having, and really being able to keep a pulse, I would say, on what these feelings, like where they were coming from, how they're manifesting. So in this video, I'm taking you through the 6 tools, the 6 hacks, 6 secrets, whatever you want to call them, that have allowed me to go from feeling like burdened by the fat loss phase to, I mean, like, I can't stress this enough. Like my last prep, I got so fucking lean and it felt effortless. Like it sucked. Like it felt like fatiguing and I felt very hungry and there were days that like sucked really bad. But the actual like concern around, am I going to get lean enough? Like, how do I create the deficit? There was no problem solving like that really at a certain point. Like, yeah, maybe initially, but at a certain point it was like, yeah, you just create a bigger deficit. And I would say like that in itself, being able to achieve that left me feeling very like the most empowered I ever have in my life relative to modifying my body composition. So this first tool, this first tip, this first trick, this is what we call thought diffusion. And this is essentially what it is being able to accept that, you were having a certain thought, you're having some kind of negative, emotion, or you're having this belief that's crossing your mind. And, maybe some carry more weight than others, but essentially rather than attaching to it, you are just letting it be simply what it is. It is just a thought. It is just a consideration. And rather than getting caught up in really like the content in the thought, letting it just sit and not acting on it. Now, there are a lot of areas in my life where I would get very like offended and I would take the thoughts that I had almost personally. And I would begin to make judgments around like, okay, well, I had this thought. Well, what does that say about me? Is this true? Is this something that, I've been running from? And I would say really like the earliest time where I can like really tie this down to like fitness was the first few diets that I went through. Like things, they would get hard and I would begin to feel very rushed and I would begin to get in a hurry around like doing something and acting on these feelings that I had, all these feelings related to like the diet itself being hard. So for instance, I would get very hungry. I would get very uncomfortable. I would start to get that brain fog. I'd start to be like, yo, I just had a meal. So like that didn't do anything. Like, what am I doing wrong? Maybe I picked the wrong foods. Maybe, I waited too long. Maybe I should have broken this up into smaller meals. And it would really like create this vicious cycle, one in which I would feel like I'm dieting, but in actuality, what would happen is that like, if I acted on that thought, I would ultimately be decreasing the deficit that I was in. And that's really the point with like thought diffusion that I think is important to understand is like, you can have these thoughts, you can not judge them, you can accept them for what they are. They are just, just transient, I mean, at best. And you don't have to act on them. Just because it feels hard, just because you feel hungry, it doesn't mean that this is an indication that you need to move, that you need to act. I mean, yes, trusting your gut, okay, that's one thing. But in the case of a fat loss phase, in the case of, a state where, energy availability is really low, it's actually going to be a hindrance if you act on it. And if what you're doing is acting on it in a way that takes away from the deficit that you're creating. And that's exactly what I would do for the longest time. Like I would be in a fat loss phase. I would begin to feel uncomfortable. And then from there, I'd be like, well, okay, obviously something's wrong with my body. And like, that's really how I felt it. Like I felt it to the, granular sense that I was like, okay, like I might die. Wasn't going to die. I was never going to like actually starve. It was like, I'm talking like at the extreme ends of like contest prep. I just like, I didn't really know how hard it was supposed to feel. So I just assumed, I'm like, okay, like this extreme feeling of discomfort, like this is too much. And like, I need to do something. I need to intervene. Now, I began to get in the habit of doing this though. Like I would react. I would have reactions to these feelings, and instead of actually just letting them come and go, I would then begin to take myself out of a deficit for a portion of the week. And really, if like those urges became like so extreme, like I mean, like early days, like these would not be like small overages. This would be me like completely eating off track. And then in turn, I would be in a surplus for those days, netting zero for the earlier portion of the week where I was in a deficit. Now, this is what we call a net zero habit. Like it undoes what happens, like it undoes all of the work you've done thus far, and it puts you in a position where like even though the action itself took no time at all to do, it's now undone days and like so much mental faculty of restriction earlier in the week. And that's really like understanding that like these actions are not costless. Like they have a very real cost, and like the cost is very high in a lot of cases, like specifically for the individual who's at the end of a diet, who is maybe at the end of a contest prep, and like the cost is now, because they have that show day coming up, like now they're going to have to push even harder when they were already in a downregulated state. And for me, like when these began to happen, I'm thinking like back to like my second or my third prep. Like I would start to get frustrated because then I would forget that these like occurrences, I would like downplay them and be like, oh, like it's not a big deal. I just had like, you know, a couple pieces of bread, or I just had a little bit more food, or I just had like one meal off. And then I would start to get paranoid about like, oh, I'm not losing weight. Like something also is wrong. I feel like shit. Why am I not losing weight? Just because you feel like shit doesn't mean you are entitled to actually lose weight. I mean, there's a lot of times where you can feel hungry, and hunger signaling can be so dysregulated while you're in a state of like moderate energy availability. It's just the fact that the hunger signaling itself is very skewed. And I would get frustrated because I'd be like, I'm really uncomfortable. This doesn't feel good. I think I should go eat. That looks good. And then I would eat it. And then what I had to do is really retrain myself to understand that these thoughts of discomfort, like these, like really feelings of discomfort, and these thoughts that something is wrong and that the answer is in like eating a little bit more, like maybe that will make this go away. That's not only temporarily mitigating that discomfort, but it's like momentarily. Like, I mean, like it's a very brief period of reprieve, which that moment, like it passes so quickly. And frankly, once you come out of it, it's not long before you're just as uncomfortable as you were prior to. And that's where really stopping myself and thinking like, okay, are these actually aligned with my goals? And why are these happening? Well, they're happening because of the reaction to the thought or the feeling. And even though most of my behaviors earlier in the week, like they were very much aligned with my goals, it was the fact that enough of these behaviors, these impulses that I would have in response to these thoughts, like something's wrong, I shouldn't feel this uncomfortable, those are the ones that were canceling out a bulk of the discipline that I was putting forth earlier in the week. And it was all coming down to the fact like I was randomly eating in accordance with my thoughts. Like I was eating in a way that was very much like, okay, like it's late at night, like stress was high all day. I'm looking for a spike of dopamine. I'm looking for something to make me feel better. And this is aligned with mitigating that feeling, not something that's aligned with achieving these goals. And it took time to like really separate those things out and understand that like it's okay to feel hungry. And not only is it okay, like it's expected. And it's okay to think even like, yeah, I want to eat something. Like I've never been someone to like demonize like wanting good food, like wanting high calorie food, wanting highly palatable food. I always, and it's funny because like in nursing school, people would like argue with like, not argue, but I like got shit from like a few of the girls I went to school with. Cause I remember one time at lunch, I was like, yeah, like I really like bad food. Like I like food that's like dirty food, like dirty, like cheat meals. And like, I remember like the terminology was so like off-putting to them. They're like, wait, this is dirty food? It's like fucking quesadillas and tacos. I'm like, yeah, it's high calorie. Like that's like the vernacular. And like, it just is really misassociating the term like good and bad food with like this idea that like that food is not aligned with my goals. Like that food is not something that I can easily track, especially like in the case of like food court or just like eating randomly. But anyways, it's getting away from the point. I think a good way to really practice, though, this concept of like thought diffusion is to put yourself in situations where people are doing that thing. People are, in this case, eating food that doesn't necessarily align with your goals. And sure, in contest prep, there are times where I'm gonna be like, no, it's like not worth it. It's not worth exposing yourself environmentally to these factors that are likely gonna pull you off track. But in the case of someone who does want to get better at being able to control these impulses and act differently, I think it's a great idea to have this just built into your plan is like, okay, like you should be going out to eat and you should be working on your relationship with food and how you view food and really the response that you choose to take, even if you have feelings of dissatisfaction, annoyance, if you're like really at a point where you're like, hey, I'm very hungry, but I'm not going to indulge in this because it's not aligned with my goals. Like, I think that you build equity by getting the exposure to do this time and time again. And I remember like early on in the first couple preps I went through, my boyfriend and I, we would go out to restaurants and, you know, he wasn't dieting, or he would be dieting, but he'd be having like a cheat meal. He would order like appetizers, a whole entree, dessert, and like a big part of me wanted to be like, I don't want to go out on these excursions. Like, I don't want to go out to eat at all because I am trying to lose weight and I don't want to be tempted by food. I don't want to have it like in my face, like thinking about it. And then I realized, like, in making these concessions around avoiding that food specifically, or just like high calorie food, instead, all I was doing was giving it more power, and I was giving it like this extra emphasis that like, no, you're not allowed to do these things, which ultimately just made me want it that much more. So what I started to do, and this is like something that over the years, like it's really been tried and true. Like I've tested myself more and more, the more opportunities that I've had. Instead, I'm like, okay, I'm going to go out to eat. And depending on how I'm feeling, like if this is like a phase where I do need to be like really controlled, like tightly controlled calories, I know generally what I can order and still accurately track. I know if I go past this, I know if I have a couple more bites here and there, what I can do is go into my Fitness Pal and I can log something that's the equivalent in carbs and fats and protein. And I can find something and like even give myself a little bit of a buffer. And it's not something I would recommend doing often, but it is something that would very much be like, hey, you need to have a high degree of food reporting, even in the case that food tracking is not something that ultimately is going to bring you closer or further away from your goals. If you're someone who's a little more flexible and you have a little bit more wiggle room, maybe it's not as big of a deal to have, you know, a 200 calorie discrepancy for one meal every week. But in the case that you're eating out pretty regularly, this very much could be something that ultimately is doing exactly what it was doing to me early on, where it's undoing that amount of discipline I was putting forth earlier in the week, ultimately then leading me to feel frustrated because it's like I'm putting forth this discipline, yet time and time again, I'm going to check in and I'm like, I'm not seeing the results that at this point I feel very much entitled to, just given that I've been making sacrifices earlier in the week. Now, in the case where, you know, I would go out to eat, I would like actually coach myself. And even if I would go out and be like, you know, like I really do want to have like whatever, chips and dip, or, you know, just have something small that's kind of like, you know, shareable for the table, I would use this as an opportunity to really talk myself through it and be like, yeah, I feel annoyed that I can't eat this, but the reason that I'm not eating this, it's not because I'm not allowed to, it's because I have a goal that requires me to have a high degree of accurate food reporting. So this is a conscious choice. This isn't me just being punitive for the sake of being a dick to myself. It's not because I'm not worthy of this food. It's not because I'm not allowed to have it because it actually is bad, or because like I don't deserve to indulge and have fun. It's because the goals I have require that I have an accurate level of food reporting each night. And to do so tonight, I wouldn't be able to accurately track this food. And even if I wanted to try, I feel like there still is that risk of honestly not logging enough calories, and then ultimately this taking away from my goals for this week. Now, this practice, this was a huge unlock for me. And this is something that like in very similar situations, I've been now able to apply whenever I'm traveling, whenever I have work events where I don't really have control over the food, whenever I go home for the holidays, whenever there are social events. But ultimately now I'm able to apply that same skill. It's like, if I'm in a state where food reporting does need to be high, I could readily just talk myself off that ledge and be like, you know, this doesn't have to be anything more than a feeling, which is understandable and normal. Yet the feeling doesn't determine that I have to have a reaction to this. Like it doesn't force me to do anything. The feeling can just exist and be just simply that. I think what oftentimes happens is that someone will have that feeling like when they're out in a social event, let's say someone does order something and I don't know, mentally you weren't prepared to like refute, to opt out of it. So then you begin to have that negative thought, and then that one leads to another thought until you're feeling that one thought with more similar other ones, creating this like full blown, like chaotic internal state where honestly you're just like panicking and you're like, why did I even go out to dinner? I can't do this. If I'm dieting and I go out to dinner, ultimately I'm going to feel like this every time. So then you build this idea around like, well, I can't do this behavior, which what does that do? Ultimately, it just makes you like glorify it and kind of put going out to dinner, going out when you're in a fat loss phase on this pedestal, which I kind of think is a deterrent. Like, I mean, it's a real shame because it robs you of the ability to practice that skill. And something that has really helped me is kind of visualizing, okay, whenever I have that negative thought, I almost see it as like, if you're ever doing like dishes and you have like a giant pan in the sink, like you have this like giant pot, and like that's literally my sink right now. Did like these birria tacos the other night, so I know, okay, like that's like crowding up the sink. Like I can't wash dishes in the sink at this point because that pot, it's like huge. It's like multiple quarts. There's stuff in it. I need to have like the whole sink able to, in order to be able to clean that dish. Now that's how I treat these thoughts as they come up, rather than just looking at it like, okay, well, we're just going to turn away and like, you know, wash the cups and wash the forks, wash the things that are easier. We're going to like pick out all these little easier to manage thoughts. Instead, I'm like, okay, what is the biggest thought, the one that is the most limiting, the one that is most impactful, and let me address that one. And when I say address, I don't even necessarily mean like actually taking action and like doing something for that thought, but rather just like assessing like, hey, is this how I actually feel? Is this warranted? Do I need to do anything with it? If I do something with it, if the potential actions that I could take, if they're going to essentially set me further back because of this thought, do I want to act on it? Will I still feel the same way after I, you know, pick that course of action? And typically what I find is that if I can at least like hit pause and give myself like that moment to really visualize like how I'm feeling and what the potential actions are going to result in, like what I'm going to feel if I essentially like select, okay, pick your own adventure, here's what I'm going to do. Well, at that point, I can have enough foresight to at least be like, well, yeah, that's going to make me feel a little bit better right now. It's going to make me feel like it's going to be enjoyable. And specifically when it's around food, sure, I'm going to enjoy the process of consuming that food. But then I'm going to be flooded with a lot of thoughts after that and a lot of feelings that are related to guilt. For me, it comes down to now I have this new body of evidence that suggests that I'm going to be non-adherent to a diet, which frankly, if I could avoid entirely, that's what I would prefer to do. Now, there's a sense of release in that like visualization process, at least for me, because in that I realize that like I can have this thought, I can have this feeling that I don't necessarily believe in and doesn't have to carry a lot of weight, but I don't need to do anything about it. I can just simply like pull it out. I can look at it like the dish and be like, yep, we're just going to watch this. We're just going to smooth this out, recognize that it's there, but I don't have to actually act on it. Now, just because you have a thought about food, it doesn't mean that something's wrong. Just because you have a craving, it doesn't mean that you necessarily have a micronutrient deficiency. It doesn't mean that you're underfed. Even at, you know, a higher body fat, even at peak calories in a build phase, I still have foods that I'm like, oh, that would be really delicious to have. And that simply comes down to the palatability of it. Now, if you find yourself thinking like I'm hungry or, you know, that looks really good, I think it would be a good idea to practice observing that thought without actually reacting. Recognize that thoughts about food are completely normal and they're even expected in a state where you're not necessarily able to have all the foods that you have cravings for. But if every time that you have a thought about food, if every time you have a craving or an impulse to consume something, because at the root of it, that's actually what it is, if you eat every single time you give into that, ultimately there's no way that you're going to make any meaningful, adequate progress. Now, the second tool is going to be reframing. So rewording how you talk about your struggles. And this is something that I'll say like with clients, I see every single week is like a pattern, whether or not someone uses specific choice of words describing around like how their week went. But there's a really strong correlation with how deeply we feel our emotions and how we describe them. So if you take the two statements, like someone's like, I feel really anxious, I don't think I'm making any progress, versus I'm having the thought that my progress may be a little slow. I'm noticing that it's causing me to feel anxious. Which one gives you a sense of control? And really, I think this is pretty obvious. Which one feels very chaotic? Which one feels very dramatic? The second statement is honestly demonstrating that, like, hey, there is a point of like recognizing that these feelings could be wrong. Like they aren't set in stone. And I think what this comes down to is like, you are not your thoughts, you are not your feelings. Like many people forget that there's a really big difference between themselves and their brain. And some things, some emotions, some thoughts can just manifest and be exactly that. And talking about your thoughts with a sense of humor, I mean, for me, it really helps. And this is something that I've had to get better with time practicing and becoming more aware around. But it's something that it's like, if I notice that I'm using like really strong language to describe my day, if, Jordan asks like, how are clients today, how are check-ins, and I can tell, and I hear myself just like being like, really negative or like using, again, really strong language, you realize like it kind of sounds ridiculous. Like it kind of sounds ridiculous relative to what I actually do. Like nothing in the realm of like fat loss, like luxury coaching, because that's essentially what it is. Nothing in the realm has like true dire consequences. Like this is all cosmetic modifications, like yes, improving someone's health, getting someone closer to their goals. But even in very serious situations, like it's not life or death. Like this is not something in which there are truly, like by definition, high stakes. And I think like what might be a better example is like when I talk about my own fat loss or when I talk about my own training, like the way that you talk about what it is that you're doing, like whatever phase that you're in, it's going to affect how you experience. And instead of saying like, oh, like I'm so hungry, I'm never gonna lose weight, if you can try to reframe that and like be conscious and be like, yeah, like I feel hungry. I feel hungrier today, but I don't need to eat right now. This is just a part of it. This reframes that experience and gives you control over your actions rather than just letting your emotions dictate that behavior. And I think this is where a lot of people get it wrong, is they will talk about their progress and they will talk about it with a lot of pent-up stress and a lot of beliefs that frankly aren't rooted in reality. And a good example is like, I'm starving and I can't do this. And if you can reframe this to become like, what, I feel hungry. And this is the most hungry I think I've felt in a long time. But I also know that hunger is representative of me being in a fat loss phase. I can handle this. I signed up for it even. This in itself is going to give you more control. And it's not to say that you need to avoid those thoughts and feelings. It's not even to say that you need to downplay them. I think that in itself is also detrimental. But I think you first have to decide, okay, when I'm going to talk about these, when I'm going to separate these thoughts that are going through my head or these feelings that I'm experiencing, what is actually occurring? Because in the state where someone is very hungry, it can feel very extreme. It can feel very uncomfortable. But I think the mistake that people make is assuming that how they're feeling it, like the magnitude of how they're feeling it, is indicative of how big of a problem it is. And, potentially in these cases where, I guess in the instance where I felt extreme hunger, at the end of a contest prep, I really have to ask myself, is this something that I can tolerate? Do I consent to continuing to tolerate this discomfort? Because at the end of the day, like no one's forcing you to go through a fat loss phase. The fat loss phase itself is something that you can decide at any point, hey, this is no longer worth it. I don't want to continue doing this. And I would say generally, if it's something that you can tolerate it, I think you have a responsibility to yourself at that point to not let these thoughts run rampant or become greater than they actually are. Now, one question I would ask yourself, will acting on this thought make things better or make things worse? And if the answer is better, then maybe the answer is to take action. And I don't mean in the state, will it make you feel better? Will it actually facilitate you getting closer to the outcome that you desire? Most of the time though, the answer is going to be that it'll make things worse. And acting on those thoughts often keeps you stuck, avoiding what you need to face in order to make progress. Now, the third tool is psychological flexibility. And this is largely going to come from a form of psychotherapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. This is a form of psychotherapy that helps people increase their flexibility and live more in the present moment psychologically. Now, it's based on the idea that people should accept their emotions, and instead of trying to control them or avoid them, they should accept that they're there and they're not something that they need to be scared of. Now, it's different than other forms of therapy because it emphasizes truly on acceptance versus avoidance. And one of the primary concepts of ACT is the voice inside your head is oftentimes going to tell you to avoid these feelings. And it's going to tell you that if you sit in these feelings, you're going to be worse. Like you're going to feel worse. Things around you are going to get worse. Now, this creates a cycle of avoidance that ultimately is going to keep you stuck. So it's important to understand the difference between psychological rigidity versus flexibility. Psychological rigidity is a cycle of avoidance that ultimately shrinks your life. It's going to take away from your ability to perform and ultimately move forward. For example, if you're afraid of doing something like public speaking, maybe you find ways to avoid it completely. But by avoiding it, it only reinforces that fear, and over time, it narrows the opportunities at hand. Psychological flexibility means that you're feeling your emotions and your thoughts, but you're not necessarily acting on them. It's about staying present and acting in accordance with your values, even though it might be uncomfortable. Avoidance is something that actually perpetuates fear. The more you avoid something, the more fearful you become, the more power that thing is going to have over you. The cool thing is, it only takes one instance, one exposure to that fear for you to break the cycle. The hardest part, though, is getting yourself to do it. So going back to the example of like going out to eat, you have anxiety about going out to eat. You feel like, okay, the last few times you've gone out and you've gone off track. So right now you don't really trust yourself with the ability to go out to eat and make wise choices. Something that I would recommend doing, and something that I found is helpful for me, has been helpful for clients, is going out to eat and knowing that the intention is to track and giving yourself an allotted amount of calories that you're allowed to work within. Maybe that means that you are looking at the menu prior to going out. Maybe that means that you are scheduling time in and around that meal beforehand to make sure that you have managed your stress appropriately, and that when you're able to go out, you are not white knuckling it and already in this super anxious state while also expecting to perform really well in this uncomfortable situation. And really in this case, what we're trying to do is avoid that sense of deprivation that can sometimes occur in fat loss phases. Psychological flexibility involves being able to feel that discomfort of having cravings and still making choices that align with your goals. So in the instance that you are nervous about, overeating at a party or a social event, I would go and I would make it very intentional. Like, hey, these are the foods that I know I'm okay to have. If they're whole ingredient foods, I know I can reasonably track them. It doesn't mean that I'm going to have to do more work on my end to make sure I account for the foods that I eat. But over time, the more times that you do this successfully, this is actually going to strengthen your ability to handle these situations, which can avoid the feeling of deprivation that can come if you're too rigid with your diet. But it also puts you in a position where you feel empowered because you know you can attend these events without it derailing your progress. Now, the next tool is self as context, which really comes down to not being overly attached to an identity that you've created for yourself. Now, many people will hold themselves back because they have defined themselves in a way based on their past behaviors and past failures. And frankly, defining themselves this way avoids any kind of uncertainty or pressure to make any behavioral changes. But if you constantly reinforce this past you're going to assume every future attempt is going to be exactly the same, which ultimately only sets you up for predictable outcomes. I get it. It keeps you safe. It puts you in a position where you are in control of that outcome, but it also limits you. It limits your potential and it limits opportunities that could have come your way. Now, when applied to these very short bursts of dietary non-adherence, such as like moments when you stray from your plan, you might be tempted to label yourself and be like, yep, like I always mess up on my diet, or I can't really be adherent. Like after 5 days, I just eat the whole kitchen. There's no way that I'm going to be able to go 2 weeks without falling off plan. Like all of these like labels and the ways that you talk about yourself negatively, you're just further embedding and giving power to this identity of yourself as someone who's not successful. Now, identifying closely with these thoughts, you reinforce that negative self-image that ultimately is going to hinder progress. Instead, I would embrace it like this. You can acknowledge that, like, hey, I fucked up. Like, yeah, I did not track. I was overindulgent. And really, the vernacular around this, I think, is so important, which we already talked about, is like, instead of calling it like, I eat like a fat ass, or I overeat all the time, or I always go off track. Like, the way that you talk about yourself is ultimately going to affect how you view yourself. So, calling it what it is, like, yes, highly palatable food is very tasty, and it's very easy to overeat it because of what is happening chemically in our brains when we do consume that kind of food. Now, the same line of logic applies to the phase that you're in describing your body image. Are you describing being, 15, 20 pounds above stage weight as obese? Are you telling yourself that you've really fallen off track because you haven't really been able to string several weeks together on a plan? You can acknowledge that, hey, right now you might not absolutely love your physique the same way that you love your leanest physique, or a physique where you do feel very confident. But this current body image, this current behavior, it doesn't have to define you. And I think this is where it's really important to observe that thought and instead go like, yeah, like I'm feeling a little disappointed. I'm feeling discouraged because I did deviate from my diet, and I know I have the discipline to be more adherent. I think it's very unrealistic to expect perfection at all times from everyone. And I think this is just another way that we can consider it self-sabotage. We can consider it a cop-out, but taking this perspective instead, I think this is going to allow you to recognize that everyone experiences setbacks, and a single event does not have to dictate or determine your entire identity. By not anchoring your identity to these slip-ups or even like potential phases where you're not at your favorite physique, you free yourself up to make better choices moving forward. And you understand that lapses are temporary and they can be separate from who you are and the behaviors that you demonstrate, which ultimately is something in someone that is capable of growth and positive change. So one of my friends, she comes to me and she's like, I don't know how you do it. I can't stick to a diet. Like, no matter what I do, day 5, day 6, like I always fall off track. And I challenged her. I'm like, okay, like let's start here. Like, do you think you could feel this way? Like, you could feel like you're not someone who's good at following a diet, but instead just act like someone who does follow their diet like to the gram, like this idea in your head around someone who's like perfectly adherent. Could you just pretend to do that and act in accordance? And I challenged her. I'm like, okay, like if you could do that, if you could just do that for a day, wouldn't that be evidence enough to show yourself that like, hey, this is technically possible? The thing that has to occur is you have to not be non-adherent. You have to be adherent. And when I framed it like that, I'm like, okay, so we are just avoiding non-adherence. So when does non-adherence happen? Like, what does that look like in your day? She's like, well, that always happens at the end of the day. Typically, I'll get home, me and my husband will start making dinner, but sometimes I get a little lazy. I'll start snacking. Sometimes he'll suggest things for dinner that honestly sound really good. And rather than be like, no, like I need to stay on track, I'll just indulge. I'll give in. I'll be like, yeah, let's order the pizza. Let's have some wine. So I was like, okay, well, if you're on track all throughout the day while you're at work, and it really just seems to be an issue at night, what if you told your husband, like, hey, I want to stay on track tonight. If you want to have pizza, wine, that's totally okay, but I'm going to get this other meal instead. I'm going to either make something or order something that I know is a part of my plan. What if you did that instead? And she thought about it. She was like, well, yeah, like that doesn't feel good to have to tell him that in advance because frankly, I enjoy the pizza, I enjoy the wine, I enjoy kicking back. And I'm like, I know, like it makes sense why you would. Those are enjoyable things. Those are very indulgent things that feel good to decompress and relax. But what if you get ahead of it? What if you avoid having to have that hard conversation when, let's say, you don't really have the bandwidth, you don't have the mental faculty to put your foot down and be like, yeah, like I really want to be on plan tonight. That would make me really happy. What if you had that conversation instead earlier in the day or even the night before? The thing is that like what most people fail at and where most people fail is often the internal struggles that they manage and the decision making that accompanies with making these decisions preemptively. So when am I going to have this conversation? When am I going to commit to staying on track? Typically people learn these behaviors and they continue to act the same way again and again because it keeps them safe. But instead, I think if you can challenge yourself to no longer let yourself identify as someone who just can't lose weight or someone who always overeats, I think this kind of self-labeling, it keeps you stuck, and it also puts you in a position where why would you learn new behaviors? You don't have to be defined by your past failures. And I think beginning to see yourself as someone who can stick to a plan or overcome these challenges, I think that's the first step. I think putting yourself in an environment where you yourself want to be that person is going to start with believing that you can be that person. So instead of thinking like, okay, I've always failed at diets, reframe it as, yeah, I haven't found a diet that is sustainable, but I'm sure there's one out there. I'm sure there's a diet out there that I can stick to, that I can be 100% adherent with. So number 5, holding space for hunger and cravings. And this is one that I think a lot of people, it sets them back because they honestly expect that if they're doing everything correctly, if their hormones are optimized, if their diet is optimized, then frankly, they shouldn't experience these things. And that the experience of these things is indicative that they need some kind of modification. Now, I've had a client, she told me, she's like, she was devastated because she felt like at this point in the amount of time that she's been bodybuilding, she shouldn't have any kind of dietary deviations. And she was really upset because she's like, okay, like I feel like at this point in my career, I should have the tools in place to not feel this immense level of hunger that ultimately leads me off track. And we were talking, and I told her, I'm like, it's okay to have hunger that feels uncontrollable. It's okay to feel frustrated. It's okay to even, feel like a little confused as to why you don't know what the proper action is to mediate this hunger. You can have this hunger and you can quite literally just do what you need to do in order to be successful and not take any steps back. And I gave her a visualization that I sometimes use, which is thinking about hunger, cravings, any kind of temptations, almost like billboards across the highway, So you're driving, and even in a fat loss phase, even though you might know where you're going and you might be like really dead set, like we're not making any stops, it's okay to see these billboards and to acknowledge them. It's okay to see pictures of, really highly palatable food and delicious food, or even like pictures, billboards that would suggest, okay, well, here, if you take this back road, you can get there a little bit sooner. These billboards represent cravings and self-doubt, and you can't remove them. Like you can't determine exactly when they're going to rear their head, but you can choose to keep staying on the highway. You can choose to not exit, to not get too distracted, to not cause any kind of road hazard, but that's also going to take acknowledging their presence without letting them divert you, because ultimately you do have to keep driving. So when we look at these points of discomfort, hunger, cravings, fatigue, these are something that I would say are like very expected and a very real part of the process. But I think learning to carry these feelings with you without letting them control you or dictate your actions, that is key. And I mean, like you can learn to make choices that still align with your goals even when you're feeling uncomfortable. Example, when you're feeling hungry between meals, recognizing that, yes, this is a part of fat loss. And for me, this was a really big turning point because it was the point in which I said, yep, I welcome it. The hunger is representative of me losing body fat. The discomfort, the brain fog, the fatigue, this is completely aligned with what I would expect during this phase. Notice how I would even think back and be like, when have I last felt this when I was not in a fat loss phase? Never, because this is something that I associate with fat loss. I think carrying that feeling with you, but staying committed to your plan rather than giving into discomfort builds a lot of equity in the long run. Number 6 is committed action. So, this is predominantly creating habits that support you reaching your goal. And this means taking action in alignment with your values, even when it's hard. So, this is already going to be difficult. Like being in a fat loss phase, physiologically, you're going to have hunger signaling, and you're going to have, really all physiological signals that tell you that you should rest more and you should eat more, because your body is in a state where it's not getting the nutrients it needs to support critical and non-critical functions. And if weight loss wasn't hard, no one would be overweight. Weight loss is hard. Losing weight is hard. Business is hard. Relationships are hard. So the key is making actions that are as easy as possible and creating an environment where there is as little resistance as possible in your ability to take that action. So I look at like physical barriers. Okay. So with like habit stacking, thinking about like taking vitamins, making sure that you take your weight every morning, any way that we can make these easy to access, like physically easy to do, the better. So what I do is like the app on my phone I use to track my weight every day. I use Renfo. It hooks up to the digital scale I have, then that digitally logs into the app and logs my weight. Even though I might go populate that weight then into a spreadsheet because I have my timeline and all of my metrics in there, it's still a good way to make sure that as soon as I'm getting on the scale, that weight is logged. Also helps having the scale right there in the bathroom. Another good tool is like swapping behaviors. So instead of just saying, we got to throw all the candy out outside the house, what I would do is put a pack of mints or a pack of gum. I'm not a big fan of gum, but to each their own. I would put that in that candy drawer, and I would actually put that ahead of where the candy is. If you want to put the candy in like a Ziploc bag, make it a little bit harder to like just easily reach into, cool. Put the gum there, put the mints there, and basically every time that you have that urge to go into that drawer, take a piece of gum, take a piece of mint or a single mint. I don't know how to say that. Every time you have an urge to go into that drawer, instead, grab a mint, grab a piece of gum, and now you've essentially swapped that behavior. And if you give yourself 5 minutes, and this is more in the case of someone who is not on like a strict fat loss phase and they're able to have a bit more flexibility, maybe you do decide after 5 minutes, okay, I actually do want a piece of candy. But I know for me, typically, whenever I give myself the ability to pause and really think it through, like, is this something that I want to do? Typically, I find if I can hold out a little bit longer, I usually come to my senses and I'm like, nope, it's not really aligned with the goal. That was just an impulse. All right. And lastly, playing it out. And this is a really strong visualization tool that I like to use, which is really thinking about what the day is going to look like if you don't follow anything. So if you were to go about your day and intentionally eat more than is allotted on your plan, if you were to order in, if you were to stop on the way, get some Chick-fil-A, if you were to get a very high calorie beverage, at a coffee shop, if you were to have a few more glasses of wine, if you were to skip your workout, if you were to not do any cardio, if you were to not drink your water, if you were to go to bed whenever you felt like it, like truly everything on your plan, I want you to do the inverse of that. Now, if you don't stick to your plan and you actually do this like just opposing plan entirely, how does that make you feel? Like really think about the next day. How's your skin going to feel? Are you going to have a headache? How's your stomach going to feel? Are you going to want to even get on the scale? Are you going to feel guilt and shame about having to message me and be like, yo, I completely fucked my diet right off? Most people let a bump in the road, like one part of their day, one little slip up, become the pothole that they get stuck in. And then they fall into this cascade of all negative behaviors that, essentially pull them down and lead to that next day hangover, metaphorically, where they're like, oh yeah, no, I completely went off track. I tracked nothing. And the way you really have to think about it is like, it's never just one decision. Like there's I have food on hand and I can easily grab it and put it in my mouth. And then, okay, that's it. Like that was a very simple stepwise systems, like to have you now overconsume and go off track. But when it comes to like not going to the gym, it's like, okay, I didn't caffeinate. I didn't put my gym attire on. I looked at the clock and I just decided to do something else. If there were any arrangements with like maybe my husband or a friend to go meet up at the gym or coordinate around a certain time so I could go to the gym, I didn't consider anything like that. And even throughout the day, like you have to think, okay, you eat 3 meals a day. So if you have a full day completely off track, just fuck off on your diet, just eat whatever you want, eat in servings that are way more than you should eat. It's like, that doesn't happen accidentally. Like there is conscious effort and choice that comes through with making those decisions. Like you are consciously deciding to source whatever meals you're actually going to have in the amounts that you're going to have them. I think if you can recognize one, this is how you will feel if you have a full day off. Like if you completely throw caution to the wind and do everything opposite of what you want to do that's aligned with your goals, identifying like that is how it's going to make you feel, like, or this is how it's going to make you feel, and really trying to like sink into that. I think that's helpful. And then I think also if you do find that you do go off track, you have one thing, you start your morning, you get Chick-fil-A on the way, you get donuts, you have like pastries at your office, you have one or two, you have the opportunity to get back on track right then. like right then, that's the moment where you can be like, oh, like, okay, that wasn't aligned with my goals, but I'm going to salvage what I can at today. I'm not going to make it worse because I know what that would feel like because I've already visualized it. I think when people don't take committed action, they feel stuck, they feel powerless, they feel helpless, whether this is in weight loss, relationships, business, and they feel conflicting feedback of no plan or action. And having knowledge like is one thing, having the ability to be like, okay, like I overeat this morning, so that means I need to then pull down food later in the day. But putting it into practice through committed action is really what defines real learning. And I think that's where when you can take a step back and be like, well, this isn't aligned with my goals. I can be present enough to know that, like, yes, this was a slip up. This was very temporary. But if I continue to act this way, if I continue to follow this course, this trajectory, well, I know what that's going to feel like. And I know I'm going to feel way worse. So I'm going to consciously opt out of that. I'm going to choose to not do that. And I think until you take committed action, you're actually robbing yourself of that lesson to course correct, which truly is a very important skill in the hierarchy of skill sets related to dieting. And I think more than anything, being able to get started and begin moving forward, even in those imperfect conditions. So in those settings where it might be hard to be adherent, or it might be a little more stressful to make decisions around food behaviors. It's like, okay, well, life is never going to be endlessly easy. It's never going to be just a smooth shot. So it's like, okay, let's do what we can now, even if that's not perfect. Even if it's not perfect, it's still better than the alternative. I think it ultimately comes down to taking small and manageable steps in order to build self-efficacy, which ultimately you do that. You build routines that support your goals, whether that be like meal prepping, scheduling workouts, knowing what you need to do when things don't go according to plan. But if you have these habits that help you succeed, even when progress feels slow or imperfect, you're going to be much better off than just simply relying on those perfect conditions or days in which you have no slip ups to be successful. I hope this was helpful. As always, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.